Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to let everyone get into the room and then we'll start. Okay, let's get started. Hi, my name is Ciulla Lipkin, and I am the Executive Director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education. This week, we are hosting our 7th annual US Media Literacy Week. And the mission of Media Literacy Week is to highlight the power of media literacy and its essential role in education across the country. We are so glad you have joined us for this evening's event, When You Are the Story, a conversation with Amanda Knox. Tonight's event is sponsored by Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And I would like to introduce Christy Roschke, who is the Managing Director of ASU's News Collab and a NAMLE board member. And she has a few words to share.
Sure. Hi, thanks, Michelle. Just wanted to say briefly that the Cronkite School is so proud to support Media Literacy Week and sponsor this, what I'm sure is going to be an amazing event. The school sees media literacy as essential to not only journalism and media related careers, but really just about any profession in the 21st century. And so that's why we recently launched an online bachelor's degree in digital media literacy, the first of its kind, and are invested in helping students gain the skills necessary to engage and participate in media, to promote civil discourse and build healthy communities. And of course, as a NAMLE board member, I support NAMLE's mission of making media literacy highly valued and widely practiced. So I'm very excited about this event. And a little bit later, we'll be joined by 3 amazing Cronkite students who will be participating in the conversation with you and Amanda. So looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Christy, for your work, for your support. We so appreciate it. So bye. I spend every day thinking about how the media we create and consume shapes our world and our perceptions. And this summer, a colleague of mine shared Amanda Knox's Twitter thread about the film Stillwater, which the filmmakers were saying was based on the Amanda Knox saga. My colleague wrote to me, "This is media literacy." I read the Twitter thread in awe and followed it up by reading her full article, Who Owns Amanda Knox, in The Atlantic, as well as listened to Amanda on podcast interview after podcast interview. And by looking at how media narratives get created and how agency and power matter, Amanda was exploring media literacy. And lucky for me, Michael Danielson, one of Amanda's high school teachers from Seattle Prep, happens to be an active member of NAMLE and a passionate advocate for media literacy education, and a connection was made. My journey to media literacy is also a really personal one. My passion for this work stems from a terrible tragedy that happened to my family in 1988, when my father was killed in the bombing of Pan Am 103. I was 17 at the time, and my family was thrust into an international news story that still continues. And my family's tragedy came to us through the screen, and my relationship with the news was immediately altered. Because once you become the news, you can never process news and information in the same way. And while Amanda's experience is unique and life-changing in ways I can't imagine, it resonates with me on so many levels. We were both thrown into situations that we didn't ask for, we didn't expect, and that were unimaginable. Both of us were subjects of news stories where we didn't get a say about what the narrative would be. And both of us have fought to get our story out. Both of us live in a world where we never know the next time another story will show up about our lives. And it seems that we both spend time thinking about the concept of justice and how we don't want to be defined by the worst thing that has happened to us. I'm truly inspired by Amanda's strength and poise and her eloquence in communicating about the issues she has faced. And I'm so appreciative that she's sharing her experience with the world and with us tonight. So thank you, Amanda, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And let me say publicly a huge congratulations on the birth of your daughter, Eureka.
Thank you.
I'm very excited for you, and I'm so impressed that you're able to be up and like comprehensible in the middle of the day. Good for you. So we have a lot to talk about, and thank you so much for being here to be willing to talk to us during Media Literacy Week. And, in your writing and interviews, you explore just so many concepts and ideas that relate to media literacy. You talk about bias, you talk about, public shaming and cancel culture and clickbait headlines and real life consequences to mis and disinformation. So I guess one of my questions is, did you know that you were teaching media literacy? And have you thought about how media literacy intersects with what is on your mind and what you write and talk about?
Well, I didn't ever really know the term media literacy. I just have stumbled upon a tragic set of circumstances and have been trying to process them through a humanist lens. Mm-hmm. And that has led me to a place of not just looking at the way that the criminal justice system is this system that is like churning human beings through a process that is greatly dehumanizing, but also the media has a very important part of that. And, I have been uniquely and not uniquely mishandled and dehumanized by the media. And I've noticed that there are a million ways that the humanity of real life human beings are lost as they are turned into characters in these broader morality plays that the media constructs about us without any sort of regard for the consequences to those real life lives that are either continuing to live or that are defined or ended in a moment by a tragic set of circumstances.
Yeah, it's interesting because today, Dan Gilmore, who's the co-founder of the Newsco Lab, tweeted out about tonight's event. And he said that for those of you who don't know, Amanda Knox experienced one of the most notable examples of journalism running amok in the wake of prosecutorial character assassination. And I think this idea of journalism running amok, I have to agree. I feel like you were the victim of that. Do you feel that way? Do you feel, I guess, how do you feel about the treatment that you have gotten from the press?
I mean, it's interesting because I feel like there are multiple ways to look at it. And on the one hand, I can say, absolutely, journalism went crazy with me and went above and beyond to portray me as this character and to sort of get as much profit off of treating me as that character as possible. And on the other hand, I think, wow, how many people are totally overlooked by media, and how is that a sort of comparative flips, another side of the coin to this problem of some people who are consumed ad nauseum and other people who are completely overlooked and forgotten. And so on the one hand, I was treated as grist in this content mill. I was treated as this consumable object, and I was utterly dehumanized in the process. But also those whose humanity, whose stories are never told, who are just sort of forgotten, despite the fact that they are also going through an incredibly traumatic experience that matters, that is in the public interest. That is another sort of form of it. So there's all these different ways that the media can get it right and get it wrong. And the way that I have had it happen to me is the one where they latch on.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's interesting because that idea and that question of whose voice is missing, one of the key questions in media literacy is what is missing that might be important for me to know. And when I teach, that's one of the things, like if there's one question someone could ask, no matter what kind of media they're consuming, it's that, like, what isn't being told? What would be, another voice that could be heard, that could be valuable? It brings to mind, so the article that you wrote in July for The Atlantic, Who Owns Amanda Knox, you wrote, I believe that journalists must always center people in their own stories and recognize what is at stake for their subjects. And this really, really resonated for me, because I just have this firm belief from my experience that news outlets very often don't consider the subject of the story. And I think of that every time I see coverage of a terrorist attack or a school shooting or a murder. I'm always thinking, oh my God, this person's family is watching this. And I'm wondering how, and it really does infuriate me. I wish that journalists thought more about the subjects. And so I guess the question is, how do you think journalists could be more empathetic? Like, what would that even look like? And how could we train them to think about the humans behind the story?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big thing, I agree with you. And I think part of that comes from this sense of a sort of echo chamber that journalists exist in. Like once you get deep into the profession and you're constantly interacting with other journalists and you're sort of churning through story after story after story, you get a little jaded to the like actual human realities of every single story that you're telling. You forget that like this thing that is a passing thing for you, that maybe you'll spend a whole year looking into a story, but guess what? It's not going to be your whole life. That for that person, that is their whole life in your hands. And if you're going to be a storyteller, you have to acknowledge not just that you aren't entitled to anyone's story, but also that you bring with your own storytelling experience, your own sets of biases in relation to that story. I think there's this mistaken notion that because you are a professional storyteller, you are objective. And because someone who is at the center of a story or who has experienced a newsworthy story, like experience that is in the public interest, they cannot be objective. They are necessarily like subjective to the point that their perspective doesn't really count, is also this really like flawed black and white notion. And someone who is at the center of a story might have a lot of perspective that is deeply valuable to the public. So thinking about it in terms of, you are a storyteller who is not just in the service of the people who are going to be consuming your story, but you are also in the service of the people who are at the center of your story.
I love the framing too. I don't think that the general public thinks about journalists as storytellers. And I think that that's like such an important distinction to make, that they are telling stories, and that telling comes with perspective and bias and all of that. I notice for me, I have a really interesting relationship with the news. I personally, I don't like to watch the news. I'd much prefer to listen to it. And I think over the years, we were so bombarded with just the horror of my dad's plane crash. And not surprisingly, that's what the media focused on. And it was the horror of it over and over and over and over again. And anytime that you hear about the plane, it's the cockpit in the Scottish fields. And so it's these horrible images. And I made a choice at some point that I think listening is better for me, because those visuals and the choices that news outlets make on the visuals to keep us watching just doesn't sit well with me. And I'm wondering, like, as someone that's obviously interested in what is going on in the world today, you're very up to date, you communicate on Twitter, like you're here. How do you keep up? Like, how has your relationship changed with the news as a human being in this world?
That's a really interesting question. I think that I'm not a tremendously avid news consumer. Like, I don't feel this sense of urgency to like know what's happening next. And I do sort of resonate a lot with you in that sense of like this sort of the saturated feeling of like horror, like the sort of horror porn aspect of especially these tragic events.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things, like the reason why media sort of pinpoints those is not just because they're trying to get at the truth of the horror of the thing. It's not like they're trying to, there's this sense of like, well, we're showing the horror because it is horrible. So, that's the truth. But the other side of it is, well, it's also the thing that gets people to click on the headline. It is triggering, and it is triggering in the way that, like, for someone who is indirectly relating to that experience, is triggering just enough for them to click on the headline. But for those who are directly related to that experience, it's so it's traumatic. And I think that my relationship with media is one in which I approach it with a sense of skepticism now, both from like entering into it as a journalist myself, but also as a consumer of journalism. And I try to be very, very careful about just attaching myself to, or when I find myself attracted to certain headlines, I try to recognize where that impulse is coming from and why I might be attracted to one headline versus another, and what is happening on a subconscious level that headline is sort of doing to me. I try to be aware of like how there is this sort of dance, there is this play, and how these headlines are very much trying not just to inform me, but to manipulate me. So I think that is, I think that's mostly what I keep in mind as I consume things that come in my direction. And of course, like, I'm just like anyone else. I have my own biases, and the things that pop up in my head and in my feed are things that have been strategically by algorithms and by, institutions catered to me. And so I always try to like take a step back and observe myself consuming, and to see like, am I doing that from a responsible position?
Yeah, I can imagine all the media literacy educators that are watching this right now and like, oh my God, she's talking about media literacy. Like, you literally are talking about it. It's like, yeah, that's what we want, everyone. But you bring up a really good point, and I want to talk a little bit about clickbait headlines, because you might notice that I'm talking about all the things that drive me crazy. But you said this was related to a tweet thread, and you said it matters what you call a thing. And that just like struck me, because I know for my personal experience in the US, they call it the bombing of Pan Am 103. Other places in the world, they call it the Lockerbie air disaster. And that is so interesting, right? Because
very interesting.
in the US, we talk about the plane, and there's a lot of kind of blame in we're looking at the airline. And there's the bombing is much more horror driven. And the Lockerbie air disaster is focused on the place it happened, and also calls to mind the people that were impacted there. And so that we've always talked about that as my family, that words matter, the way we talk about things matter. And the idea of, what happened in 2007 turning into the Amanda Knox story, or you bringing up like Clinton's affair being the Lewinsky scandal, like it misses the mark, and they don't recognize those power dynamics. But here's the problem, right? Is people identify and remember these events based on these initial terms. And that's why I think clickbait headlines are just so unbelievably dangerous, because they impact our basic understanding of news events. But now we're living in a culture that you've already referred to, like that click rates and social engagements, like these are measures of success for journalism. So it's like, how do we address that? How do you think that we should be combating that?
That's a really good point. And I think it's funny, when I tweeted before I wrote this whole like tweet thing, way back when Rudy Gaudet, the person who murdered Meredith Kercher, when he was released from prison, I noticed headline after headline going, Amanda Knox is like the person who killed Amanda Knox's roommate, released from prison. And I was just like, wow, this is just so indicative of the problem. And I made like a little tweet about it because I was like, hey, look, they're calling it the wrong thing again. And I actually got responses from people saying, well, what are we supposed to call it? We all know about this thing through you. So like, that's just the way that it is. And that feeling of just like defeatism, like, oh, well, that, you know, you're just associated with it. So like, that's just the way it is. And we all know it through you, is first of all erasing the, like, just ignoring the impact it has on my life personally, but also is erasing the fact that there is a real victim here who lost her life, and that should be acknowledged. And there's also a real perpetrator. And if we want to correct an injustice, like, part of it is the identifying of that object. And I think part of the issue is that, again, it kind of goes back to follow the money. So if journalism, like if media outlets are getting more clicks and more money from those clicks because they are using one term over another, then we see that there is a capitalist problem with the way that we have tackled media issues. And how do you deal with a capitalist problem? Well, either you create regulation, or we as consumers have to start having a better relationship and more higher standards of our media outlets. So when a media outlet misnomers an issue, we can either decide not to address it, or we can directly respond. Now that we have a world of direct responses and more conversation, more back and forth between regular people and the media, we can demand a better standard. Either way, I don't think that it is appropriate to say, well, that's just the way it is. I don't think that that's taking into consideration the consequences to the real human beings involved. And I feel like the people who have been directly impacted by newsworthy stories and have been overlooked in the process of us coming to an understanding of what is appropriate and not appropriate in terms of media, in how the media interacts with these stories.
I find I've seen you kind of respond over time about certain stories. You've brought up the Monica Lewinsky and just kind of what the narrative painted around her. But recently you talked a little bit about the unbelievable amount of coverage of someone like Britney Spears, and this idea that, like, why is her like private legal battle like in the public? Like, you say this isn't a concert or an album. It's not designed as a piece of entertainment, but our hunger is relentless. And I think that, like, that phrasing, our hunger is relentless, like, that's such a powerful point, because that is like exactly what is happening on social media, in the communication systems, that is way too much information coming at us way too fast. And it's like, how do we possibly satiate an insatiable appetite for gossip and drama? And I'm wondering, I think it's just really interesting because we do see these over and over again with women also. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why these particular stories seem to resonate with you.
Yeah, I think the major issue is because what I have found is that once you become someone who is public, who is not a private person, but a public person, for whatever reason, be you accused of a crime or be you a professional entertainer, once that happens, suddenly the world feels entitled to every aspect of your life. And every aspect of your life is deemed in the public interest, even if it actually is not. Like, it's not. It's literally not. So I've always been like, really, I remember somebody when I first came home saying something to me like, oh, what happened to you is so tragic, because it's not like you were asking to be famous. Like, there are, you know, people who are famous because they want to be famous. And so it's okay that everyone sort of just piles on and like gets into every little bit of their life. And I was like, no, I actually don't think that that's true either. Like, there should be, in the world of even public facing people, a line. Like, this is where, this is my public facing person, and this is where I exist as a private human being with relationships and children and private lives. And the idea that, like, I was fascinated by this idea that this moment with Britney Spears was interesting because there was a lot of like advocacy in her for her. There was a lot of compassion wanting to be expressed for her. And yet her experience of all of those documentaries and news sources was not like a positive experience for her. And so ultimately it came down to, well, I'm glad we're all sort of getting on the bandwagon and like pro Britney's rights and, how has she been exploited? But in the process, we're doing the exploiting too. And so maybe we should be a little bit more aware of when these like online surges happen in the name of a story or of a person. Like, has anyone bothered to ask that person how they feel about it?
That, I think, is such a wonderful theme throughout your writing, and the idea of entitlement and around the film Stillwater, like, you were so clearly like, just ask me, like, I would have talked to you, and that idea that like people don't think to do that. I do. And there's two things that I want to talk about. One is the idea of documentary and what is documentary. And then also when we fictionalize people's life stories. But with documentary, I feel like for whatever reason, people believe that a documentary is really based in fact, right? That it is factual. And I've seen some of the Britney Spears documentaries, and the people that are interviewed are 7 steps away from who Britney is. And, it's just absurd to even call it a documentary. And we have to be incredibly deciphering and critical of even documentary work. And that question of, were they involved? Like, to me, that's the first question I ask if there is a new documentary out. And I think that people, I'm not really sure why that is, but I know there's been pieces about you that you have been involved with. And then there are pieces that you haven't been. And it's like that. I think it's just important as viewers and as public that we understand that those should be weighted differently.
Yeah. And I think that goes back once again to that idea that this isn't just like a sort of, a documentary isn't just this like historical moment. It is a story that is being told by a storyteller. And a good question to ask about a documentary is, who is this storyteller? Where are they coming from? And if they have the involvement of the subject, like, why, how did that involvement happen? And if they don't, why not? And that those are always really interesting questions. And I gotta say, like, I'm very familiar with the documentary world because I've taken part in a documentary, but I've also been approached by documentary filmmakers time and time again. And you get that another step of that sense of entitlement when someone comes to you and says, hi, I'm doing a documentary about you. I want to interview you. Can we do it next week? And by the way, if you don't, I'm just going to like tell your story without you. And it's just not going to be, I'm just going to have to do whatever I'm going to do. And like, there's this sort of like feeling of, if you don't do it, I'm going to like misrepresent you. And this, like, there's this sense of like, I'm the one who can tell your story, and you better take up this opportunity because you won't have any other opportunity. And what's unfortunate is, on the one hand, that is a little bit true. Like, not everyone is approached by 100 documentary filmmakers. Maybe there's one time a documentary filmmaker comes into your world, but like I've sort of advised people before on this. Like, people come to me and say, hey, there's this documentary filmmaker who's coming, who says he wants to tell my story. What do I do? And the first question I say is, ask him what he'll do if you say that you won't be involved.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Just see what he says.
Yeah. And if he's
And
willing to
if
do
he-
it without you, then there's
And then there's that, like, okay, so if you're doing it without me, that's interesting. Why do you feel like you can tell the right story about me without me? And
so well said.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder, I know for my experience, I just like recently this week, actually, I went to listen to the podcast, and there was this whole episode about Libya and Gaddafi, and these are the people that were blamed for the plane crash. And I remember, like, thinking it was going to be like, oh, the episode's going to be about like Facebook or something. And when I looked, like, I literally was like, oh, come on, like, I don't want to listen to this right now. And there are times where I think to myself, why are we still talking about this? Like, how is it possible that we're still talking about this? Do you ever feel that way? Do you ever feel like, why are people still talking about me?
Oh God. I mean, yes.
Yeah. Or for this, at least. Yeah.
I mean, because I understand why I still keep talking about me. Like, I'm still personally impacted by everything, but like, why does everyone else? That's a great question. And I think that it's always astonishing to me, because it's not like there is a dearth of stories out there to tell. It's not like there aren't newsworthy things happening every single day that get overlooked. And it still strikes me as like this utterly tragic thing, that not only is my story like continuing to be told, but it keeps getting told kind of in the same way over and over and over again, and recycled, and like the same sort of really just like black and white, oh, girl sex crime thing, like, is still people still feel like there's something to like squeeze out of that, and that people will latch on to. And it's so base, and it's disturbing to me, because I do think that like, any story has a million different things that you can talk about it. Like, there's in my case, there's so many ways that you can talk about it. You can talk about the misogyny, you can talk about the current criminal justice system, you can talk about police conduct, you can talk about a young disenfranchised men who then end up committing crimes, you can talk about young women who go and study abroad and then have horrible things happen to them. There are like a million things that you can dissect about any story. But why is it that certain sort of avenues that are very narrow are the ones that end up getting honed in on over and over and over again? And that was sort of my critique of Stillwater, which was, if you wanted to fictionalize my experience, why did you do it in such a way that it was so obvious and so like not nuanced? Like, why did you just have like the girl's sex crime? Maybe she did it, maybe she didn't do it, she must be somehow involved, end of story. Like, we've heard that already, and that's obviously not the case. So like, I expected more. And it's unfortunate that people who are in positions of incredible power and privilege and resources are continuing to be what I think are lazy thinkers and lazy storytellers.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I often say, like, there are so many stories to tell. Why do we keep telling the same ones over and over again? And I think, the situation with Stillwater and the way that you have brought in these like bigger questions about like, what is the responsibility of these creators, and how do we hold them accountable? And I think I have such an issue with like the based on the true story genre, because I think it's actually a very dangerous genre because it's fiction. It's fiction, and people walk away thinking they have true understanding about a certain person or a certain situation. And there is a reason it's just based on a true story, and there are real like facts and characters added and drama added and things taken out. And those choices by Hollywood, the entertainment cycle, I think doesn't get looked at enough. We focus so much on like the nonfiction, the news, the documentary. And I think you've brought up just really important points about the choices that writers and directors make. And to fictionalize, it's, really thinking about how do we hold them accountable. And I guess like that would be a question. I think I know what your answer is because of some of the things you said, but this idea of like, how do we hold Hollywood accountable for the based on a true story genre? Like, what do we want to see? Like, I feel like I have an opinion about what I wish they would do, but I'd love to hear yours.
I honestly would love to hear what you think as well, because like this is like it's all like, I love how you're tapping into how all of these things are interconnected, because it's not like just, a verdict that happens in a courtroom is just sort of exists on its own, and it doesn't then like branch out and ripple out into, well, now it's depicted here in this like in this news report, and now it's depicted here in this like made for TV movie, and all of these things just like ripple off of each other. And like telephone, like the more you get away from the source, like the more distorted and it becomes. And yet there's still real life consequences. Like we as human beings recognize the story that is associated with this name and this face, and we have decided that that person exists only in that story for us. And if they ever try to exist outside of it, it violates our sense of like, we're sort of like shocked to realize that they also like have cats and like have a job. So like I was more inspired by the fact that there is this interesting conversation happening in Hollywood about appropriation and how broad swaths of people have been misrepresented and exploited in the past, but there hasn't been that sort of crucial, but also individual human beings and their stories have been distorted and exploited for the sake of entertainment. And it's especially tragic because very often these like true crime stories, like people who have had like the worst things happen to them, are given the least amount of protections in Hollywood. Like I was talking to a woman who works in Hollywood recently and is like starting this sort of consulting group of trauma survivors who are sort of media literate, informing producers of the impact of their storytelling on survivors.
Okay, that's amazing.
It's super interesting because like, and she explained this to me because she was like, I've worked in Hollywood for years. And she was like, hey, just so you know, like there are like trauma resources and stuff given to actors who portray crime victims, but there are none of those resources made available to actual crime victims.
Like, that is fascinating.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah,
and it's like, I wonder why. Well, like actors have agents, and actors have like all of these rights because they're in this industry. Meanwhile, all of the rest of us who become news stories, we're not in the media industry. We're not in Hollywood. We don't have any representation. We are alone, and we end up getting exploited because we have no one to have our back. There aren't any standards of conduct that have been made. And so what it really means is like, it takes a sort of surge of traumas and media survivors to stand up and say, excuse me, I have rights, and for other people to recognize those rights. So
I wonder, we're going to bring the students in soon, but I just have one more question. I mean, I have 17 other questions, but one I'm going to ask. It's just, sometimes I wonder, life is a lot different in 2021 than it was in 2007 and it was in 2011 when you came home. And, now we live in this kind of environment where we're talking about this stuff, right? And even when you think about the way you were really a victim of mis and disinformation, like active campaigns. And now this is all we're talking about. Like we're talking about mis and disinformation. We're having congressional hearings about it. And I wonder if you ever reflect, even with the impact like social media is having now, on whether or not your experience or your story would have been different if it happened now. And like, do you think, like, I think I want to believe that we've made progress. So I guess the question is, do you see, are you hopeful at all? Like, are we at least asking the right questions? Like, I don't know. I'm having
the good news is that people are acknowledging that misinformation is a thing.
Yeah.
So That's good. And
Yeah.
it's also good that people are acknowledging things like echo chambers. That did not exist in when I was on trial. But it was a definite, it was a very astute and accurate portrayal of what was happening on the like sort of the guilters side of this. Like, oh, if you are only exposed to information that vilifies or defames or is misinformation about me or about this case, well, of course you're going to have a biased opinion that is not based in fact. So like I think it is interesting that today we are asking the right questions about this. However, what I also have noticed about today is that we are asking these questions because we are so deeply already entrenched in like this, in sort of biased positions. And we are all sort of like deep below the surface of just like a regular objective reality. And we're all trying to claw our way to it past, like, we're just buried under whatever sort of echo chamber we happen to find ourselves in, that the algorithms have sort of narrowed us down into. And that is fascinating because there's so much noise. We are all flooded with information to the extent that like it is hard. There's literally no time to parse through and discover what is true and what is not. And that is the problem today. Where, because there are no more gatekeepers, really, we all can find whatever we want to find, and we can all believe whatever we want to believe. And so what we as consumers now, like, there's way more pressure on consumers to be the gatekeepers of information. And that means that media literacy is more important than ever. Because like back in the day, we didn't have to worry about whether or not somebody was reporting something was true. We could just allow it to be and it was fine. And we'll just consume what is given to us and have trust that that's it's coming from an appropriate place. And that doesn't exist anymore. So yes, I think that things would have been different. I don't know if they would have been better. It's just, there's just different problems.
Yeah, different factors is great point. Okay, I'm going to bring in our wonderful ASU students, Mariah and Camila and Ryan. This is always the stressful. Okay, good, you're here. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to turn it over to you all and take it from here.
All right, I guess I'll just kind of lead the way. First of all, thank you for doing this. Thank you for having us. So I just kind of wanted to ask, do you, as like from a reporter's perspective, do you kind of think that there's a way that we can report on stories with empathy without risking like being seen as biased by our audiences today? Or?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's funny how like empathy is considered bias.
Yeah.
As long as you're reporting truthfully, I think that you shouldn't, like, it shouldn't be a bad word for people to like care about the subjects that they're writing about. Like, I really don't think that is the case. And especially when we're entering into a world that is going to be less defined by the big institutions of media. And we're actually finding more and more people drawn to the personal connection that is made between a storyteller and their subject. I think that you needn't worry about the idea of there being bias. In fact, if anything, if you sort of tell your audience, hey, I'm a storyteller, and here's the bias that I'm coming into this conversation with. Like, hey, I'm sitting across from from a person who I kind of like, even just in general, whatever their story is, I just like them, and that's going to impact the way that I'm going to be telling their story. Your audience is smart enough to appreciate that. I feel like we're entering into a world where, as the more journalists are acknowledging their subjectivity, the more they're trusted, as opposed to like this sense that like, oh, if I remain aloof and objective, I honestly, like, whenever a journalist pretends to be aloof and objective, I actually am more skeptical of them. And I think that consumers of media are also becoming more savvy to that it's actually better to acknowledge that you as a reporter and a storyteller are invested in whatever way that you are invested.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi. So my question is, what are you think, as we're journalists ourselves, what are some ways that we can share with others to recognize misinformation?
So I think a really good way, first of all, is to be good practitioners of skepticism yourselves. So definitely like have moments where you call into question even the things that you are sharing and consuming yourself, to basically like in a way that's where it's like show don't tell, show people how to be good consumers of media as professional media consumers yourselves. Because first, like as media, you know, creators, you are also above all else media consumers, and to show like be a professional media consumer as much as you're a professional media creator. And that's actually a really great way to share, because then at that point it's less like do what I say, it's more like, hey, check out how I'm doing it and you could do it this way as well.
Hello, my question is going to be, how are you helping people now that might have been in your situation or something similar? And how can we help as journalists having a platform and other people that have platforms as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things that I have found that is that was lacking in my own experience, but also I find is the reason why people come to me and ask me to tell their stories, is because a lot of people who have like stories to tell are not storytellers. That's not their talent. And what they're looking for is not like it's not that people don't tell their stories because they don't want to. It's because they don't feel like they have a voice or they know how to. And so as a storyteller, you not only bring the platform, the opportunity, you also bring the skill set. And what you can do as a storyteller is help a person find their voice. You can help the person discover their story, and it can be a sort of healing exchange even for that person. Like as much as you're a journalist, you're also kind of a therapist. At least that's how I've found, where it's like, hey, I'm listening to you without judgment, and I am helping to understand from your perspective how to process your experience. Because what's important to me as a journalist isn't just what happened, but what does it mean? And what it means often can be found through the direct experience of that person who's impacted.
Yeah, I'm going to add something too here, because I think from, you know, the fact that you are all studying to be journalists, I think what's really interesting is when you have been, you know, consistently asked to be interviewed, you know, and you have time and time again, it's really easy to tell whether a journalist cares. Like it's easier than you think. It is so easy to know whether this person is invested or cares at all about you as a human being. And I guess I would love you to answer this question, Amanda, for Mariah and Camila and Ryan, is how I've done a lot of interviews, and some of them are so wonderful. Some are so great, some are powerful. And then some are just, they're horrendous. Like, I can't wait to stop talking because I know immediately that this journalist is not going to do my story justice. They did no research. They know nothing about me. What, in your experience and all that you've done, when do you know you're in good hands? And what is it that tells you that you're in good hands?
That's a really great question. So, you know, it's never quite the same. I think there's always like little red flags about knowing that they're not going to be treated well. One of those ways is when someone sort of gives away the fact that they've never done any homework, really. Like, especially if you're someone who has been asked to speak about something already before a number of times, you can tell when someone has not actually bothered to find out if you've ever talked about this before, and or is approaching it from a place of like, oh, I have this preconceived idea about what your story is and what it means. And so I'm going to give you the opportunity to be a soundbite in my construction. And instead, it's more like if someone is approaching you with genuine curiosity and a sense of like there is something more here that is not just, you know, I'm not just trying to dig for the latest scandal, but I'm just trying to like get a grasp of the human experience. That is a person that I trust. It is someone who is thinking more deeply about the facts of the things that happen. It's not just the surface level, what happened. It's the, what does it mean? How does this all relate to all of us? And what are the sort of broader consequences, not just to this individual, but to all of us as a society?
I'm sorry, I hijacked the conversation. So back
That was great.
back to you guys and your questions.
You know, I know it's been, sorry. I know it's been some time since your story has really been in the limelight, but what was something missing that you felt you needed during your experience and what you saw on TV, and when you landed off, when you got off the plane and you got back home and everything kind of took a whirlwind? What do you think was missing in journalism right then in that moment?
Oh God. So, I mean, the thing that's always really bothered me about the way that my own case was specifically handled was that there was this insane attention on me and not the proper amount of attention on the actual people who were very much at the center of the story, who were actually the movers and shakers of the story. I was somebody who had something bad happen to them, and I didn't really have a lot of say and a lot of agency in the equation. What I had hoped for, and what I think would have been a more responsible way to cover this case, would have been, first of all, to spend way more attention on the person who actually murdered Meredith, but also on the police officers and the detectives who were bungling this case. I thought that of all the people, like there was all of this attention sort of focused on me and what did I do and what was I saying, what was I wearing that day, and what are my eyes looking like, am I crying or am I not crying? And all of these questions ultimately were not the things that were going to make or break this case. What was going to make or break this case were the people who actually did things, who were making decisions and were like actually shaping the course of events. I was not. From my prison cell, I was not shaping the course of events. And what I was wearing that day was not going to decide that case. So when people were focusing on those aspects, it was deeply frustrating for me, because it's like, do I have to like disappear for you to notice that there's evidence? Do I have to disappear for you to notice that there are people who are bungling this investigation, or who are saying outrageous things that are unsupported by evidence in the courtroom? Those are real, like, in the public interest aspects of this case that went totally overlooked for the sake of like speculation about my hair. Like, it was insane. So I think that, like, when I look back on this case, I'm continually surprised that I'm not treated like the peripheral character that I really am. Like, I am a peripheral character to this story. I didn't actually do a lot to shape it. I have a lot of perspective given what has happened to me, but like, I didn't do a lot. There were people who were doing a lot, and those people deserved attention because they had a lot of power that they were imposing upon the lives of real human beings.
Mariah or Brian, are you next?
I'm just trying to, I don't really know how we're deciding the order because we're in like
Okay.
separate rooms.
Brian, you go.
Okay.
That's how we're deciding.
Let's see. So yeah, kind of why do you think the media at that time just focused so far away from the important characters? Why do you think they were so sensationalized back then? And do you think we're still seeing that today, or are we kind of growing apart from that?
Well, I would suggest that so the way that the media works right now, the way that it is funded, is such a way that like whatever gets the most attention is what sells. And so they always went for what was going to get the most attention. And what do we like? I think, as much as he probably hates this, the journalist who was interviewed in the documentary about my case really like revealed it. Like it's sex, it's violence, it's women. This is what sells. What it doesn't sell, like the story of yet another young, disenfranchised man who like is, going on this like downward spiral. He commits a crime. Like that's a story that doesn't captivate people. It's also not a story like, interestingly, like the story of, misconduct on the part of authorities is a story that would captivate, except at the time that wasn't really in the public interest. Sex was. And so that's what they sold the story on and continued to sell the story on, was sex, 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 women, violence, sex. And so I think that was a big reason why the attention focused on me and not the other, two people who were accused, my boyfriend and the actual murderer. And it's also why I think, like, unfortunately, the actual victim in this case was largely forgotten, was because she was portrayed. There was this, the whole case sort of harkened back to this like Madonna whore dichotomy. And of course, like in the Madonna whore story, the Madonna is not as interesting as the whore. And so, of course, like me being portrayed in the role of the whore became the center of everyone's focus, the center of everyone's vitriol, the center of everyone's projections of their fears and their fantasies and their loathing. And that triggering thing that made you want to engage with the information that was coming your way. It's those kinds of things like that sort of the kinds of headlines that make you want to react were being funded and well funded by the rest of us. We were basically telling the media what we wanted to hear from them. And it was sex, violence, women.
And you've also spoken so well about how even when kind of the facts of the case were coming out, that they kept trying to bring it somehow back to their original idea. And you talk about bias and like cognitive bias, confirmation bias, and how they just kept trying to tell the story. They wanted to get their story right. And that is just like,
and that's the prosecution's angle, right?
Yeah.
And they're incentivized because they don't want to admit that they've made this tremendous mistake. So they have this sort of conservatism bias where they're going to only change and shape their story enough that they can sort of kind of make sense of the new information that's coming in, but mostly they'll just ignore exonerating evidence and amplify what they have deemed to be, inculpating evidence. So this is like, that is on the prosecution side, but on the media side of it, it's whatever sells. And new information coming in that, oh, wait, maybe she wasn't a whore, is not selling the news. Nuance doesn't sell, unfortunately, as well as responsible, nuanced journalism, at least in the way that media is structured today. I do think that there is, because people are being more aware, are being made more aware of how they are being manipulated, how they are being triggered. They are becoming more wise to paying attention to the things that are so obviously triggering. And they're sort of acknowledging that, like, if they are engaging with that material, it's a sort of guilty pleasure. And I think that the more and more we see the consequences of those things in our own media storytelling, the more people are going to call into question whether or not that guilty pleasure is worth the cost.
So I know we're at time. If it's okay, Amanda, I want to give Mariah a chance to ask her question, and then I know you have a child to take care of. So
I don't know if you heard her.
Oh no, we didn't. Oh, but okay, Mariah, did you have another question? You are muted.
Sex thing, because everyone says like sex sells and stuff like that, especially with news and particularly in sports and in women's sports. So I thought that was cool. And interesting that you said that. But my question would be, how, after all this, 2007, now, in between, how do you stay sane and how do you deal and cope with being a hot topic in the media?
I think in the same way that I sort of coped with it in prison, which was that very often it feels like, I mean, it's a big issue for me, right? Like I do feel like my identity, like my very life and my identity was usurped for the sake of entertainment ultimately. And so I'm constantly sort of feeling like I'm digging myself out of this grave that I've been buried in, that people wanted to just sort of pack me down and like, oh, you're just Foxy Noxy, that girl who was accused of murder, just stay there. And I'm like, I'm not dead and I am definitely not that person. So don't, like, I have this sort of like drive to engage and like have a relationship with that dilemma. And at the same time, I also can't let that become my obsessive, like my entire life is about this and all my emotions are wrapped around it, because it would feel so consuming. It would feel like it was on top of me. And a lot of times, like the way that I dealt with this in prison was honestly to just try to put the situation that was on top of me in front of me, to look at it from a certain distance with curiosity. Like I am learning, like I'm looking at something that is happening to me and I'm learning from it and I am processing this experience and I am gaining knowledge from it, and knowledge is power. So as much as like it is deeply frustrating, I try to remember that I don't have to just be reactive to it. I can be proactive. I can look at what's happening and draw knowledge and experience that is valuable, not just to myself, but to others, and then take what I know and put that out into the world. So that's, I do feel like as long as I am capable of having that sort of relationship with it, where I am learning and then doing the best I can with what I have, I don't feel like I'm trapped, is the thing. But it's, you know, I'm saying now, we'll see how I do.
Well, thank you so much, Mariah and Camila and Ryan. And, you know, you're training to be very important people in the world. Keep going. We're so glad that you're passionate about journalism. We need you to be. And Amanda, I do have to say just that one of the things that I have noted in all of my reading and listening to you is that you have this incredible way of saying, yes, this was bad, what happened to me, but it could have been worse. And you've said over and over again that you're still alive and you're here. And that's one of the most, I definitely recommend everyone read Amanda's book. It's really just, she's a beautiful writer. But this idea that you're able to have that perspective is just, it's brave, it's amazing. And I'm just so glad that you're using your voice. I'm so glad you're sharing yourself with us and with the world. And I just wish you the best in everything.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I can't tell you how, I mean, it's an incredible thing for, your loss like breaks my heart. And I know that like one of the things that's so horrible about it is your dad can't tell his story.
Yeah.
And that burden sort of falls upon you, a person who doesn't have all the information. That is so hard. And I'm so sorry. So like, hang tough, girl.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I feel like resonates with me is that, you know, as my family and I have gone through all this, we've always had that attitude that, yes, we lost so much, but there's so much we still have. And that desire to not make my dad's death matter more than his life. Right. And that is, there's something about the way that you talk about just, you don't want to be defined by the worst thing. And I think that that's just, I don't think everyone feels that way or acts that way. And so I think we should be proud of ourselves. That's what I'm going to say.
Okay.
That's where we're ending it, Amanda. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the Cronkite School for sponsoring this event. We have so much more going on this week. It's unbelievable that it's just day one. Please check out medialiteracyweek.us and find more events and have a wonderful night. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thank you for your great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.